welcome for everybody here. I have designed this talk in such a way that I have been frequently asked few questions whenever I go and talk to public here. I thought I will spend some time just getting those through so that I'm sure you all are very familiar and aware of this, but maybe some are not, maybe some are complicated because the research in all this are not done properly, I think, primarily because the origins that I'm going to talk are not available in the original text. So there have been some writings, some internet writings, some information here and there. So there is lots of loose information in the international arena. But this is some questions that people keep on asking. So maybe I'll clear those. And then I will move on to really how Buddhism was introduced and how Tibet's Buddhism really flourished into neighboring countries like Mongolia, China, and eventually how the Buddhism came to the West. I'm afraid to say that my presentation do not really cover other Buddhist countries, Southeastern countries, so I'll have to beg forgiveness from you all on this. So main questions are, people, even if I'm talking to students in the lecture or anywhere, people says, what is this Tibetan Buddhism? Can you tell me, is it different from any other Buddhism? I go for meditation, is that Buddhism? So this question comes on. And then people ask, what is Pali Buddhism? And is Tibetan Buddhism Pali Buddhism? What is Sanskrit Buddhism? Is Sanskrit Buddhism same as Pali Buddhism or is it same as the Tibetan Buddhism? So there seems to be quite a mixed of information. People are still not clear. So I thought maybe I could expand on those. So that's my main motivation to accept this talk. This is basic information which you all know. Buddha, but there are some disputes on the actual day when he was born, but I have been taught, this is in my memory, 563 BC is when Buddha was born, and everybody knows that he was born as in the royal family, a place called Lumbini, which is now in Nepal, and his energy for striving to be enlightened was through the experiences that he gathered by going to the different four gates, and he saw a child's birth, a sick person, a death, and an old age. So this is what really history says, which inspired him to find out what is this. And he went on to search for answers for those, and he did meditation, and at the age of 36 he was enlightened. So this is, I think, all we know. One thing we all know is from the age of 36, Buddha taught for 45 years until his death at the age of 82. So coming to the answer that we are looking for is just after the death, in the same summer when Buddha died, in that particular year, the first compendium, in the most of the texts you will see the first Buddhist council, and there are now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things like this. And in Tibetan, this is called katu, means the compilation of what he taught, because what he taught was all oral. So in the summer of his death, the first compilation took place, and during the compilation, in the texts that are available in Tibetan things are that there were 500 bodhisattvas present. Then Kun Khao, I'm only going by what Tibetans have written, but nowadays, if you look at search internet, they try to find equivalent Indian names. How accurate these names will be if we translate back to India, I'm not so sure. So we have Kun Khao, they say is Ananda, then we have Wesung, and then we have Ngeba. Those were the three people who really, and together with the 500 bodhisattvas, they did the first council to come up with a form how to preserve what he taught. So that was the first stage. Then at that stage, it seems Kun Khao, Ananda, was the person who has the best memory at that time. And whatever he recorded, there were lots of questions and answers between themselves. And whatever he remembered was recorded. And at that time, the main compilation was on this Praktish Moksha. And that is really, in Tibetan, it's Nyente Sosotharba. That means the teaching that Buddha did to all the ordinary peoples, because we believe that Buddha taught, he spoke, and they were spoken to all kinds, all levels of receptiveness of individuals, even to animals, demigods, gods. We don't have gods, but in the 6 realms, we have the highest as bodhisattvas and Goncho, things like this. So there were the people, and the teaching, main teaching, the first compilation was on the how to not only purify, how to make renunciation and how to obtain enlightenment only by yourself. So that was Sosotharpa. That means try to learn how to proceed to the next stage by yourself without involving others. So that was the main thing. And at that time, you can imagine there were many languages Buddha is supposed to have taught. When Buddha taught, it is said that he didn't speak in Sanskrit, he didn't speak in Pali, he didn't speak in other languages. It is assumed that Buddha taught in such a language that whoever can hear, he heard it in the language he knew. So if I was a Tibetan at that time and he was speaking maybe whatever at that time, I would have heard it in Tibetan language. So that was the theory behind Buddha's teaching, that Buddha taught and people received at the stage of mental faculties that each individual had at that time. So for the next, there are many variations of time, for 100 to 120 years, all the monks, because you have to imagine at that time, the community of Buddhahood was sanghas. So there were monks and nuns, and they were doing the prayers compiled at that time, and people just did their prayers and went on for probably for over 100 years, or plus 100 years. The text that we have in Tibetan is I got it here as a Buddha has taught not in a language that is, maybe he taught in a language that he knew, but whoever received it received in the language that he knew. So in here it says all the sounds of God, demigods, underneath the animals in the oceans, even in the human beings, the language that he taught were received by any people who can speak whatever language they were using. So this was the language. Whatever the people are receiving the language that he is teaching, and that he taught in that language. So this was the basis, because there were so many variations of teachings that were available. So if you continue with the conundrum, the composition, the compilation of the first stage were very well known. I'm sure everybody knows from here that the three Patika in Tibetan is called Tenesum, and they are the fundamental of all Buddhism. First is the disciplines, the rules of the monastic life, the nunnery's life. Then the second is the teaching, the sutra itself. We have Totitene. Then we have the treatises, explanations, commentaries of these teachings by various other people. So these are three fundamental bodies of the Buddha teaching that is available to date. So this is in Tibetan. So then, over a period of time, each monastic life in India, there had been many people, many communities doing their own language, however the Buddha taught and however each individual community's language is received. But there was an attempt to consolidate, standardize. This happened probably around 116 years after his death. So then we have four main languages under which the Buddha's teachings were compiled. We have this Shithamje Yoparmeva. So this is, main thing is in here is all things exist is one of the teachings of Buddha. And now people translate this into Saraswati Vata, and this was available in Sanskrit language. Then those texts that were compiled into Pali were Netenteva. This is the form of Buddha's teaching where the highest order of lamas, highest order of the people who knew best were worshipped, and whatever they said became part of the teaching. In the Rangshipaka, this is a language that was available in lots of people, and they tried to compile this together, and that is Mas Sangatita. The fourth language is now, the third and fourth language is even dead now. There is none of the texts at that time compiled were available now. So what is present in this world is those were available in Sanskrit and in Pali. The other two languages died. Therefore, we have four main languages available for the Theravadic tradition. I'm not touching Mahayana and Vajrayana at all. This is all Theravadic teachings that he made to all the ordinary people at that time. These 4 languages that I've gone through were subdivided during a course of many years into 18 different languages, because people learned and taught and did their own things in different languages, subdivided into first into 18, then into another 23. But whatever was done, whatever was divided, they got divided out of these 4 fundamental teachings that were compiled during the first compilation. So, and these were standardized, and all of these, whether it's 4 language or whether it's in 18 language or 23 or as many as languages, every single one of them were accepted as true words of Buddha. So this is an essential part of this. Then we have the Mahayana compendium, and it is said, because there are many schools of Theravadic lines do not accept Mahayana as a pure teaching, but within the Mahayana tradition, they believe that this is a true teaching, and the true teaching in the sense that this Mahayana teaching and Vajrayana teaching were made by Buddha and received by a higher realm of people, a higher understanding, higher faculty people, and all these teachings were made in Sanskrit. Therefore, we have a combination of, again, same things, same rules as we have for Theravada. We have the text as we have for the Theravada. We have also the doctrines, the commentaries that we have Theravada. So all the compilations, both for Theravada and Mahayana, were done exactly in the same format. First is the rules of all these monks and nuns in the monastic life, then the teachings of the Buddha, then the commentaries of the Buddha. And it is said that at that time, when the compilation of Mahayana teaching was done, the Vinaya teaching, the discipline and the rules were done by coming Buddha, which is Buddha Matriya. Then the teaching itself were all done by Vajrayana, we call it Chana Dorje, and the doctrines were explained by Jampeyang, Manjushri. So it is accepted that there is no argument whether a part of Mahayana teaching is out of Buddha's mouth or not, but during the compilation, these were accepted as true teachings, whether we accept now or whether we argue this was not taught. That is an argument that really comes within the last couple of centuries, it looks like. So this language was only in the Sanskrit, and Sanskrit at that time was called Lage, means God's language. So repeat again, we have all the Mahayana teaching, all the Vajrayana teaching are in Sanskrit, still intact, but only in Tibetan language, because Sanskrit is no longer a language that is used. The Theravada teaching, which was made in Sanskrit, is still available, but in Tibetan language. The Pali text that we have, the Pali canon, the pure Theravada teaching, we had originally 4 teachings. Now we have 2 Theravadic texts available, one in Pali and one in Sanskrit, but that Sanskrit is now available only in Tibetan language complete, and some in Chinese language, because they also did lots of translation. So the other 2 languages, the Mahasangita and Samitraya, they are no longer available. These are teachings of Buddha that are not available in this world now. So I'm more or less repeating this. So in Tibetan language and in Tibet, we say, you often hear His Holiness saying, Tibetan Buddhism or Buddha Buddhism that is practiced in Tibet is complete because it has all the texts of Mahayana translated from Sanskrit. The one text of Theravada translated from Sanskrit, and the Vajrayana that is available in Tibet, and one text fully available of Pali that is for Theravada, and Chinese, I'm not sure what has been translated, but we know China done lots of translation, and China imported Buddhism before Tibet, so they have done lots of translation as well. So these will be available in Chinese language. So to sum up to my various questions that I have been asked, we could say that whatever is available in now, all the texts in Tibetan language, whatever the text that is available in Pali language, they are all true teachings of Buddha, Buddhism as a whole. We could say there is no such thing as Pali Buddhism or Sanskrit Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, because these are labels that are given because of the origination of the language or the place that is happening. Because Tibetan Buddhism is only referred to as Tibetan Buddhism because it's practiced in Tibet, but Tibetan didn't have a. There are many commentaries, there are many alterations, and there are many additions, but Buddhism as practiced in Tibet originates from the Sanskrit translated works that was available in India at that time. So this I hope it has made some clear that in terms of Buddhism, whatever is available now as a literature in Pali, in Tibetan, in Chinese, they were, depending on whether there is mistranslation or not, they were properly translated, and they were the origin of Buddhism as taught by Buddha. That much we can all say, that there is no alteration. Then I want to talk about how Buddhism spread out after this initial stage. And the main character is the Ashoka. We call it Chogyal Nyangeme. And he ruled India, huge empire, and he was the main supporter of Buddhism after Buddha's death. Because after Buddha's death, Buddhism, although they had compilation, people did lots of things, and there were lots of arguments on monastic lives and everything. But Ashoka combined the Buddhism and brought it into his empire. And all the, it is said that all the major Buddhist sites now available in India were either constructed or worked through by Ashoka. So he was a great patron of Buddhism, and he really made Buddhism a state religion, and from there the Buddhism took a great, how can I put it, expansion really. And during his time, this is the depth of the expansion. So you could see from Burma right up to, towards the end of Greece and Egypt and all this. All this belt were, during his time, all related to Ashoka's empire, and Buddhism spread to all these countries. The next stage of how Buddhism expanded in India, this we are all talking in India. India is between 3rd and 6th century. There was another empire, Gupta Empire, and during this time, the Nalanda school, Nalanda universities were built in now what is called Bihar state. This is, you often hear His Holiness making reference to the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism, and this is the seed of the universities where the Buddhism took hold and great expansion, and it lasted from 350 to 1280, and then many events happened in India. So the Tibetan Buddhism, in the last line I got, came direct from the teachers of Nalanda University, notably Shankar Devi, Nagarjuna, Arya Devi. They are the main people who brought commentaries, who brought the Buddhism into Tibet. So then now we go to our empire. Tibet had a huge empire. Sometimes people don't even realize. And the most famous is Songtsen Gampo. He lived from 600 to 650. He was the first king to bring Buddhism into Tibet. Okay, I got wives and all this, but his main contribution was he sent many Tibetans to India to learn Sanskrit, to study Buddhism, and when they came back, there were the people who translated, who worked, and who really nurtured Buddhism in Tibet. And from Songtsen Gampo onward, there were, he is the 33rd king, and up to the 38th king, there was a huge expansion, and Tibet was at that time the main power that was controlling the whole of the Central Asia, from China to Turkestan, from Nepal to including Mongolia. So we controlled the trade, we controlled the business, we controlled everything in what is now Silk Route. So Tibetan Empire, Tibetan kings were very, very powerful, And with this, Buddhism was introduced into all the neighboring countries, to Mongolia, to China, so the 38 kings spread the Tibetan Buddhism, and he was the first king who really introduced the monastic life as we know, building of monasteries, sponsoring of children, families, giving one child to the monasteries, so that he really duplicated whether there was any how in India when there was monastic life, we don't know exactly how, but when he introduced it, he replicated how Buddhism succeeded in India, and he did the same thing in Tibet by opening up monasteries. And in the monasteries, people, all the people, parents were encouraged to send children to study in the monasteries. People were asked to sponsor. So it really took hold of, and the gift that we still do in Tibetan custom to the monasteries is a byproduct of how he introduced the Trisong Tenzin introduced Buddhism into Tibet, and the legacy that he left is still with us. Then we can go on to say, I'm not so sure whether we'll be able to cover everything, but with this, in this time, Tibet was the center of power. It was the center of intellectuals, center for all the learned peoples from Turkey, from China, from Mongolia, from India were coming. Huge expansion, and everything from Sanskrit, all the texts were translated into Tibetan language. So it was a golden age for Tibetan. And the first monastery that was built was the Samye monastery. And we can still, people still see, I haven't been to Samye, but I'm sure there are some people who might have seen. They built part of this whole Samye monastery. This is the Samye monastery, built in 1775. Part of this was dedicated purely for translation. So we had Indian and Tibetans working together, translating all the works of Sanskrit into Tibetan language. So I said this already. With this expansion, Tibet conquered Mongolia, Manchuria, China, Turks. So we have exported this Buddhism into these neighboring countries because they were within our empire. But like any other empires, it came to an end with the 44th king, and with that, the Buddhism in Tibet nearly died completely. And with that, 840, the Buddhism died in such a way that people stopped sending gifts, people stopped sending people to the monasteries. Monasteries were without monks, and everything sort of went, downsized everything. So it took about 250 years of Tibet, just death of Buddhism, near to death of the Buddhism, and the empire, lots of fractions. The history is not very nice, but the revival of Buddhists again took place, and this time the revival of Buddhists came from Ladakh and Kashmir side with Atisha. So by that time, as the Buddhism was reviving in Tibet, the spread of Buddhism at that time, and in the second phase, we call it Tembangata, the Chidar. This is the second stage of the spread of Buddhism. We didn't have an empire then. There was no big controlling authority who can spread religion as a state. So different monasteries, different people, patronage, took different, built the religion into different areas, into different schools. So but all the elements of the Buddhism stayed, but in a very, very downsized way. But it was reviving. And at that time, Mongolia took, we lost our independence at that time. But my main talk here is the Buddhism, so I'm cutting out lots of information. When Mongolian Empire took over Tibet, we were lucky that Buddhism was reviving in Tibet. And the Mongols at that time, nomadic tribes, Genghis Khan's warriors, they found solace. They found the teaching of Buddha useful. So, although they conquered us, they took our masters and they made Buddhism a state religion in Mongolia. That's why how Buddhism got spread out into Mongolia and Manchuria. Again, during Mongols' time, Buddhist cultures were all exported from Tibet into China, because China, this Mongol Empire also controlled China. So we had access to the Chinese empire, Chinese royal courts, Mongol royal courts. So the flow of Buddhism remained constant, although in a slightly downbeat compared to the empire that we had before. After the so then after the Mongol Empire, we had Tibet was made independent by Mongols because the Mongols took the Tibetan Buddhism as a state religion for them, and they invited the most learned Lama at that time into the royal court, and he gave Tibet as a present to rule Tibet. So Dongön Choye Phakpa, from the Sakya school, became the first religious ruler of Tibet through Mongolia. And this religious rule of Tibet by religion, through a religious as temporal, stayed from 1254 right until 2011, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave the temporal authorities to the elected representatives. So it's a long span of time that Tibet was ruled by a dual authority with religion and temporal together. So then after that, Mongol Empire was overthrown by the Chinese Qing Ming dynasty, and Ming dynasty, how can I put it? When Ming dynasty was really a Chinese, this is the only Chinese empire, Chinese dynasty. Before that, it was Mongol, but they administered through a Chinese administration. If you look at Mongol Empire, Yuan dynasty. China now says Yuan dynasty, but Yuan dynasty is a Mongol empire. Chinese empire itself is only the Ming dynasty. Ming dynasty was then overtaken by Manchuria. Manchu empire then took over the Chinese empire and retained the same. The Manchu is same as Mongol people, and then they kept the same relationship with Tibet, and in fact it was more consolidated during the Manchu Empire, the relationship between Manchu Empire and the Dalai Lama institution. So 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama was installed, and from 1653 to 1913, the Ming Manchu Empire we had a priest-patron relationship with Manchu Empire, and Tibetan religion was still influence in the political arena, in the intellectual arena. So the Buddhism that Tibet took from India was spread out in all these Central Asian countries right up to still now, you could say. So this is just a picture of Manchu and fifth Dalai Lama. This is a very bad slide, but I think I have all these yellow things. I'm trying to say the Tibetan influence of all these empires that we are working on. The various empires that China now says they are Chinese empires, they were not Chinese empires apart from Ming Empire, but the Tibetan Buddhism was the most influential intellectual, philosophical for all these empires, and Tibet remained, the Tibetan Buddhism remained a constant link between all these empires with a great influence, I would say. So now I got, so this is how it spread out, Buddhism into Tibet, and I'm just looking at the new things now, and maybe I'll go this a little bit quicker because I'm going to take lots of time here. In America, the Buddhism first came from Japan through the West Coast during the Gold Rush. Europeans, of course, they have encountered Buddhism from 16th to 17th century in India, Tibet, China. And to Tibet, Buddhism, especially England had encountered Tibetan Buddhism when they were in India. Buddhist society, which we're today here, was set up in 1924. Really, in the West, Buddhism spread out through immigration. It wasn't how can I put it? It didn't spread like any other religion, or if you look at Tibet itself, the Buddhism that we had was spread out predominantly from the very beginning through a force because of the empire. Afterwards, there were Buddhism stayed because of the philosophical need or the relevance that the different empires of Manchuria or Mongols and Chinese took from Buddhism. But when it came to the West, it didn't come with any individual people coming to teach and convert, but they mainly came through immigration. So this is just London's Peace Pagoda in Battersea Park. And now I want to talk why Buddhism is and how it took really is still very much. I feel there is some not romanticism, but people still want to learn, and they find lots of things in Buddhism that they want to learn. Doesn't mean they have to give up their own religion, but it really complements, or it gives them extra knowledge or extra feeling that Buddhism gives to many people in the world now. So I said Buddhism spread to the West through immigration, and Tibet, especially for the Tibetan Buddhism, I think in the 1960s, after World War II, many hippies came to India, and it just so happened that Tibetans lost the independence, and we were forced out of Tibet to India, and the migration, or the cross-section of Tibetan coming out of Tibet from a very reclusive and secluded area to India, and Western people trying to broaden their views and find more things came to India, and it was a great mixture. So I think all the hippies who came to India in 1960s and 70s, they learned many things from Tibetan refugees, and many have gone to become professors and teachers in different Western universities because of the teachings that took place in the refugee camps or in some Tibetan monasteries in India. So it is said that 1% of USA, 2% of Europe, 2.4% of Australia, 1.5% of New Zealand are now Buddhist. These are countries which have no real links to the Buddhism prior to, I would say, mid-19th century. And China is estimated to have, although China Communist Party is do not accept religion, but it is estimated that China has over 3 to 400 million Buddhists and growing. So this is just His Holiness was awarded the prize for the highest prize of United States by President Bush, but I just wrote there is no priest-patron relationship between these two. It is an honor that Bush gave to His Holiness for the tireless work that he has done for humanity, not only for religion, Buddhism, but for the humanity. So we could see what are the appeals of Buddhism. So I could say, since the collapse of Soviet Union, the revival of Buddhism, because when Soviet Union took over all the Buddhist republics, including Mongolia, Buryatia, Kalmykia, Tuva, all the monasteries were destroyed completely, like China did for Tibet. But now there is a huge resurgence of Buddhism, and this His Holiness has taken special interest, because His Holiness is always saying, where the individual, where the countries were originally a Buddhist country, needs to revive the Buddhism, and his mission is not to convert non-indigenous Buddhist people. So he took great interest in revival of Buddhism in Mongolia, Buryatia, Kalmykia, and Tuva, and it's flourishing now. One aspect is the interaction of Buddhism and scientists now through the tireless work that His Holiness has engaged for the last 40 years. And Tibetan Buddhism, I say Tibetan Buddhism because it is just a label. Extensive study of the mind. It has given lots of studies that neuroscience and psychologists are now studying, because the Tibetan Buddhism can offer something for this science of Western discipline. Tibetan Buddhism studies and training of mind now is so famous, or you could say mindfulness is now how can I put it, everyday word. It originates from Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist texts, and it has become a school curriculum. So the rich, not in the terms of doctrine, but the language and the essence of the teaching is coming into the school. One other thing that up until maybe 20, 30 years, the Western scientists thinking of the existence of mind or soul has never been addressed. It is always accepted that the mind or soul, whatever, however you define it, it was in the brain. Everything is in the brain. Now, in the last, I would say, 20 years, scientists have not accepted the existence of mind or soul as a separate entity from body, but they do accept that the brain is not mind or soul. So, although they do not accept the teaching of Buddhism, training of mind, and the existence of mind as a separate entity from your body, but the fact that brain study has revealed that it do not have the soul, or they doubt the soul is there, it gives the inside knowledge that what Buddhism, because in Buddhism you tend to analyze in such a way that it's all analyzed through the mind itself, subtlety of minds. But in the Western science, it's all agreed through, only accepted only when you see or only when you feel of the existence. So this is the difference in this discipline. So maybe in 20, 30 years, they will find mind also exists separately. I don't know whether Desmond as a doctor will accept this or not. But one thing for sure is the study of mind training and meditation is opening up field for neuroscience and health education for the treatment of mental illnesses. That's for sure. So the Buddhism, one of the appeal is now linked with the psychology, neuroscience, mental health, which will, I think, go further still. And this is a picture of His Holiness interacting with various scientists in Dharamsala. And this is now, thank you from me. I'm sorry it took very long. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Very much. Do you have time to answer some questions?
Yeah. If I can answer. Don't ask me any technical, mind-boggling questions.
Could you say something about actually the Nalanda tradition?
Yes. Nalanda tradition, I think is a label, you could say, but the tradition actually came from the monastic life and the university. Nalanda universities existed for many many years, almost over 1,000 years, and it is a subject the, astrology, medicine, Buddhism, language, everything was taught. But Buddhism, together with the Sanskrit and astrology were debated, because at that time, during Nalanda's, in the height of times, there were lots of challenges to the Buddhism from the Muslim faith, from the Hindu. So they were all the time challenging. And the Nalanda tradition in itself is the Mahayana teachings of Buddhism that were mainly the commentaries of Nagarjuna, Arya Devi, and these were the people who promoted, who really analyzed the teachings of Mahayana texts. Not only because all the texts were not encrypted, but in words, yeah? And they were the people who dissected what it should mean, what it meant, so it outflowed like that. Something like this.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Given that Tibet had independence conceded by China, what was the actual role of Chinese governments in Tibet?
Now?
No, I'm talking about during the Ming and Qing dynasties, and also the Kuomintang.
So, in terms of administration, none. The relationship that we had with the successive teachers, successive high lamas and priests of Tibet, with the different empires, Chinese, Mongol, were really, we were offering the court, the education, the religion, and they were protecting, supposed to be us. So that was the basic of the relationship. But in terms of administration, we had no real, Chinese had no control over Tibet. Did you answer? No? No?
I'm just thinking of the Englishman in the 18th century who wanted to get to China, and he was prevented by the Chinese governor of Guangzhou province. So he thought it'd be clever and try and get through Tibet, only to find that the governor had been moved from Guangzhou to Tibet. The good news was that the governor had actually become blind in the meantime, so he didn't recognise him. That's the only way I happened to know that there were Chinese governors in Tibet. So I just wonder what their role was.
I haven't heard of this particular case, really, because all the Europeans who tried to enter Tibet, they all came from India, almost all. Maybe there were some people came from Hong Kong side, but that would be quite.
This was before Hong Kong.
Yeah, yeah. But I haven't. Do you know the person's name?
No, not at all.
No.
Somebody gave me a tape of this on when I was convalescing.
Yeah. I don't think you said somebody tried to get to Tibet through China.
He wanted to get to China and was prevented because he was brought before the governor of Guangzhou. And he made another attempt trying to go through Tibet. And it was the same governor who had been transferred by the Qing Empire.
Qing Empire.
But he'd gone blind in the meantime, so he didn't recognise him.
Not
What came of that, I don't know.
not sure. Sorry.
What do you think of the prospect of having a kind of integrated education system that includes, well, like a sort of Western Nalanda tradition? Do you think there's a possibility of that?
I think, His Holiness is now not in the sense of a Nalanda type, but His Holiness is promoting this secular ethics, which is his main address is, he's saying religion, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or Hindu, whatever label you put, is failing a great section of the population. There are over 1 billion human beings in this world who are atheists or do not accept religion. So if religion is the only route to get success in learning emotion, training mind, then he thinks this has failed. So we need a secular ethics where religion as a label, mindfulness is a very, the concept is similar. Mindfulness origins come from all sorts of religion, yeah? Different people put different labels. But this is now taught into schools without a religious context. But it is still serving, calming the mind, understanding mind. Yes, so in this kind of things, yes, there's very much, I think, need. And His Holiness is pursuing quite a lot through Emory University. They call it C learning, social, ethical, and what is it? CSEE, emotional learning. Right. Yeah.
So social, ethical,
and emotional learning. And we're trying to promote this into school curriculum so that children are brought up with all the fundamentals of calmness of, mind, things like this from the school age.
And are there any schools in England where they are doing that?
I think in Northern Ireland we have,
One in
yes,
Northern Ireland?
yes, but here it's very difficult.
Yeah.
But people are working, and to get to this, you need. There are some organizations who are doing this, but they need teachers to be trained, curriculums to be ready, and the syllabus needs to be accepted.
Yes.
And the syllabus needs to. The existing syllabus needs to have some reference point to the C learning. In this case, it will be quite easy to bring in.